If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, you should check out Riverside. Riverside is an online recording studio that lets you record podcasts and video in studio quality from anywhere. And if you click on the affiliated link in the episode description and you buy a subscription, you will also be supporting the podcast. And if you are going to start your own podcast, or you just want to continue to listen to great podcasts, you're going to need headphones or speakers. If you click on the Amazon affiliated link, you can get great deals on headphones and speakers. And if you make a purchase, it will also help support the podcast. And if you ever want to read a book I have mentioned on this podcast, I now have an affiliated link for Bookshop. All the affiliated links that I mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. This is just a reminder that this podcast has merch and a Patreon, and if you could contribute to one of those to help keep this podcast going, I would greatly appreciate it. I need to give a content warning for this episode. In this episode, there is some graphic violence. I will leave a timestamp in the episode description in case you want to skip over those parts. Alright, now let's get into the episode. When talking about the life of a royal from history, the word love didn't often play a role in their life. Many royals got stuck in loveless marriages. Sure, some royals got to marry for love, and some ended up falling in love with the person that they were in an arranged marriage with, but those cases were the exceptions and not the rule. If a royal from history wanted to find love, then they often had to look outside their marriage, with mistresses and favorites. But sometimes with those, you had to be careful, especially when your favorite was a man that everyone around you despised, and you were a king in the 14th century. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the first episode of the 4th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. We are in season 4 of History Shelf, and it is titled They Are a Rainbow. This season of History Shelf, I will be covering each week a historical figure that was a part of the LGBTQIA community. These were people that during their time, they had to hide a part of their identity from the world. So while I fully believe that those who were out and proud in their lifetime, even if it had the potential to cost them everything, deserve to be praised and recognized, those are not the people I will be covering this season. I am covering the ones that were made to love in the shadows, the ones that had to lie to most or all of the people around them. Now, I know that sexual orientation and gender identity are complex, and some of the terms I will use to describe these subjects were not around in some of their lifetimes. So, obviously, some of these subjects wouldn't have used the same words to describe themselves as I will be using, but I don't want to get too hung up on my wording. I just want to celebrate a part of these individuals that in their time there was pressure all around them to feel shame about. I want to focus on that love and gender are not black and white. They are a rainbow. And for this week, I am talking about King Edward II. Edward was born on April 25, 1284. He was born at Carnarvon Castle in Wales. His father was King Edward I of England, and his mother was Eleanor of Castile. He came from the house of Plantagenet. Edward had many siblings. Edward was one of 13 children. Edward was the 13th child. The birth order went a stillborn girl, Catherine, Joanna, John, Henry, Eleanor, Countess of Bar, Joan, Countess of Hertford, Alphonse, Earl of Chester, Margaret, Countess of Brabant, Mary of Woodstock, an unknown boy that died shortly after birth, Elizabeth, Countess of Hereford, and then Edward II. When he was born, prophets said that he would lead England to glory and that he was the new King Arthur. So, I said earlier that his parents were King Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, but that doesn't mean that those were who raised him. Like many royals throughout history, Edward II was not raised by his parents. He had a wet nurse that was either named Mariota or Mary Mounsell, and then she became ill, and Alice de Lagrave became his foster mother. Edward hardly knew his parents growing up. Edward's older brothers died when they were young, and so did 3 of his sisters. The stillborn daughter Eleanor gave birth to, and Catherine and Joanna were the sisters that died young. His sisters died before the oldest son, John, was even born. Edward had a religious education, though we don't know much about his education. He probably spoke Anglo-Norman French and possibly some English and Latin. He possibly didn't know how to read or write, though. A man named Guy Fawkes was responsible for his discipline and writing and military skills. Edward enjoyed horses. He loved dogs. He had a particular fondness for greyhounds. He was a jokester. He liked playing jokes on his friends, like sending his friends hunting dogs that didn't like to hunt. He himself did not like hunting or falconry, but he did have a love for music. Edward stood out for his time in more ways than one. He was tall and muscular, and he was seen as good-looking during his time. He was also nice to his household staff and other lower-class workers. That was rare for someone with his status to do that during his time. Hell, that's rare to see today. On August 28th, 1290, Edward's father betrothed Edward to Margaret of Norway. Edward was 6 and Margaret was 7. That marriage never happened because Margaret died in September of that year. If Margaret had lived and they had gotten married, then history may have went a little differently. Edward's mother died on November 28, 1290, leaving Edward's father heartbroken. Edward inherited the county of Ponthieu from his mother. Edward's paternal grandmother died on either June 24th or June 25th, 1291. His grandmother was Eleanor of Provence. I'm not sure how these deaths affected Edward, but Edward was young and he didn't have a close relationship with his parents. I don't know about his relationship with his grandmother, but I can't imagine that they were close. After Margaret died, there was a search to find Edward a new bride. A French bride was considered. This was to gain peace between England and France, but that idea was abandoned when England and France went to war in 1294. Which, there's something that you need to know about England and France. If you look back throughout history, you will find that England and France have almost always either been at war with each other, or at the very least, they hated each other. Guy, Count of Flanders, suggested that Edward marry his daughter, but that didn't come to be because King Philip IV of France put a stop to it. Between 1297 and 1298, Edward was regent while his father was away in Flanders fighting against King Philip IV. Eventually, peace was reached between Edward I and Philip IV. As a part of the peace treaty, Edward I married Philip's sister Margaret, and Edward II was betrothed to Philip's daughter Isabella. At the time of the betrothal, Edward II was 14 years old and Isabella was 2 years old. This pairing was made because Edward I and Philip IV were in a dispute over the Duchy of Gascony. So, through the children of Edward II and Isabella, a descendant of both Edward I and Philip IV would inherit the duchy. Edward had a good relationship with his stepmother, and she gave Edward II two half-brothers. The first one was Thomas of Brotherton, 1st Earl of Norfolk, and the second one was Edmund of Woodstock, 1st Earl of Kent. Thomas was born in 1300 and Edmund was born in 1301. King Edward I took Edward II to Scotland in 1300. He made him the commander of the rearguard at the siege of Carlava Rock Castle. Edward II was made the Prince of Wales in 1301. He got the earldom of Chester. He went to Wales to receive homage from his Welsh subjects, and then he went back to his father in Scotland. There, Edward II captured Turnberry Castle. In 1303, he besieged Brecon Castle. In the spring of 1304, he entered into negotiations with Scottish rebel leaders, but those failed, and so he helped his father siege Stirling Castle. There was a rift between Edward and his father in 1305. Edward was being a typical rich kid, and he believed that he deserved to have more money from the crown. Edward got in a fight with the royal treasurer, Bishop Walter Langton, over it, and Edward's father sided with the bishop. Edward and all of his friends were then banished from court, and all of his financial support was cut off. But eventually, the two reconciled. Edward II was very close to a man named Piers Gaveston. Who was Piers Gaveston? Piers was the son of one of the king's household knights, and he joined Edward II's household in 1300. Edward would have been 15 or 16 when Piers joined his household, and Piers was around the same age. Piers's exact birthday is not known, but it is known that Edward and Piers were about the same age. The two had a strong bond. Then King Edward I exiled Piers to France in 1307. No one knows why. Now, I feel like I should pause the story here to say that there is no evidence that proves 100% that Edward II was a member of the LGBTQIA community or that he was involved in a sexual and/or romantic relationship with Piers, but historians have debated this for years. I feel like there is enough evidence to say that this was a good possibility. And I feel like there is enough evidence to justify including Edward II in this season. You will find this season that with a lot of these subjects, you have to read between the lines. So, did King Edward I send Piers into exile because he was having a relationship with his son? Maybe. Before Piers left, Edward II gave Piers lots of gifts, and he went with him to Dover to see him off. And he was devastated over him leaving. This is what a chronicler wrote about Edward and Piers during their time. Quote, "Upon looking on him, Gaveston, the son of the king immediately felt such love for him that he entered into a convent of constancy and bound himself before all other mortals with a bond of indissoluble love, firmly drawn upon and fastened with a knot." End quote. It was also recorded that before Piers was exiled, Edward asked his father if he could give Piers the county of Ponthieu. This angered the king, and he started pulling out Edward II's hair in great handfuls. Edward tried to get his stepmother to make his father bring Piers back, but it didn't work. There were also comments that were made after Edward's death that may be evidence towards Edward's sexuality. But I do want to state again that these statements were made after Edward's death, so Edward was not alive to be able to confirm or deny these statements, and they could have been made to try and further ruin his reputation and legacy. because during this time, homosexuality was seen as heresy. In 1334, Adam O'Riordan, the Bishop of Winchester, was accused of saying in 1326 that Edward was a sodomite. But he defended himself by saying that he didn't mean that about Edward, he meant that about Edward's advisor, Hugh Despenser the Younger. More on Hugh a little later. And the Mo Chronicle said in the 1390s, 7 decades after Edward's death, that Edward gave himself, quote, too much to the vice of sodomy, end quote. Like I said, historians have and are still debating just what Edward and Piers's relationship was. Some believe that they were just really good friends. Though I want to point out that throughout history, many homosexual relationships have been described as being really good friendships. Some historians believe that it would have been impossible for the king to hide a homosexual relationship, and that is honestly a fair point. It would have been difficult. A royal was hardly ever alone. But there were people that were commenting on Edward II and Piers Gaveston's relationship. It would have been rare to see someone come out and write or say that the king was a homosexual, but the fact that there was any discussion about the closeness between Edward II and Piers Gaveston, I think says a lot. There were some people that weren't afraid to voice their opinion on Edward II and Piers Gaveston's relationship. Some believed their relationship to be disgraceful. Two of those people that weren't afraid to voice their opinions were Edward's wife's uncles, but more on them in just a little bit. Piers was called a sorcerer, which was a code name during that time for a homosexual. Some are quick to call Edward II bisexual because he was married to a woman and he had children and he had mistresses. He had an illegitimate son named Adam Fitzroy with one of his mistresses. He was born around 1307. Edward may have also had an affair with his niece Eleanor de Clare. Eleanor was the daughter of Edward's sister Joan. But I don't think that that is proof that he was bisexual or pansexual. Edward was king. He knew that he would have to marry a woman. He knew that he would have to produce heirs. It didn't matter how he felt about it. It was what was required of him. And so while I don't believe that the possibility of Edward II being bisexual or pansexual should be ruled out, I just don't believe that the wife, kids, and mistresses are proof that he was. I want to point out one more thing before I continue on with the story. Edward II and Piers were wedded brethren, which is like blood brothers. So what that meant was that they both knelt down in a church and declared their loyalty for each other. And the ceremony is much like a wedding. Things got bad between England and Scotland again in 1306 when Robert the Bruce declared himself king, which there is something that you need to know about England and Scotland. If you look back throughout history, you will find that England and Scotland have almost always been at war with each other, or at the very least, they hated each other. King Edward I sent Edward II to take care of Robert, but not before he made him Duke of Aquitaine and he knighted him in a lavish ceremony. Before the ceremony, King Edward I brought back Piers Gaveston, and Piers was knighted along with Edward II in that lavish ceremony. But Piers would be eventually sent back into exile again when he and 21 other knights left camp to go to France for a series of tournaments. The king was mad and he took away land from the knights, but he eventually cooled down and he pardoned everyone but Piers. Now, again, we don't know why Piers was singled out. Edward II went to fight Robert, but it did not go well for Edward. In September of 1306, Edward returned to England to set a date for his wedding. King Edward I was in Scotland with his army in 1307, and Edward II was supposed to join him in the summer. But King Edward I died on July 7th, 1307. And so that made Edward II King Edward II. On July 20th, 1307, he was proclaimed king. On August 4th, 1307, he received homage from his Scottish supporters. And the first thing that he did as king was he ended Piers' exile. He made Piers Earl of Cornwall. That was a title that was supposed to go to one of Edward's half-brothers. And he arranged for Piers to marry Edward's, niece, Margaret de Clare. Edward also arrested Bishop Langton. That was the one that wouldn't let Edward take more money from the crown. In 1308, Edward traveled to France to marry Isabella of France. When he left Piers in charge of the kingdom. That was unusual for someone of Piers' status. On July 25th, 1308, Edward married Isabella in Boulogne, France. Edward was 23 years old at the time, and Isabella was either 12 or 13 years old. That was unusually young, even for the time, but they probably didn't consummate their marriage until years later. Edward took Isabella to England after the wedding. When they arrived in England, Edward immediately abandoned Isabella and ran to Piers and started hugging and kissing him on the cheeks for several minutes. On February 25th, 1308, there was a grand ceremony where Edward and Isabella were both crowned at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was organized by Piers. Piers showed up to the party wearing purple. Purple was only a color that the king was allowed to wear. Piers would become to be called by some as the second king, and that was meant to be an insult to Edward. During the banquet, Isabella was left to her own devices, while Edward and Piers sat together. This was the incident that Isabella's uncles took issue with. Two of Isabella's uncles left the wedding ceremony in England early because they were disgusted by the way Edward was acting with Piers. Edward and Isabella would go on to have children. They would have 4. Edward III was born on November 13th, 1312. John of Eltham was born on August 15th, 1316. Eleanor of Woodstock was born on June 18th, 1318. And Joan of the Tower was born on July 5th, 1321. All but Edward's illegitimate son Adam would outlive him. Adam died in 1322, shortly after joining Edward in the Scottish campaigns. So, what was Edward like as a king? Well, he wasn't a good one. He was lazy, had a temper, he was indecisive when it came to major issues, he was not good with money, he had inherited debt from his father, and he made it worse, though he was getting better with money towards the end of his reign. If a bishop disagreed with him, then he would punish them. His court had a lot of music and minstrels. Court was glamorous. There were gold and silver plates and jewels everywhere. Edward had a pet camel and a pet lion. There was a snake charmer and 52 nude French dancers at court. During his reign, he continued on showing favoritism to Piers. They even spent Christmases together. Edward also allegedly gave Piers some of Isabella's jewels from her dowry. And Edward was not giving Isabella the money that was promised to her. But Piers, he always had money. At first, when Piers returned from exile, the barons did not mind, but their opinions quickly changed. Piers had a lot of influence over the king, and the king gave him a lot of power. Parliament met in February of 1308 to figure out what to do about Piers. There were a lot of angry barons that didn't like Piers, and things almost turned to violence, but Henry de Lacy, 3rd Earl of Lincoln, was able to cool things down. Parliament was held again in April of 1308, and the barons were clear. They wanted Piers gone. They wanted to send him back into exile, and they were supported by France and by Isabella. Isabella was tired of being ignored and having her husband use Piers over her. Edward did not want to send Piers away, but he gave in and he agreed to send him to Aquitaine, and he was stripped of his earldom and he would be excommunicated if he returned. At the last minute, though, Edward could not go through with it, and instead he sent Piers to Dublin and appointed him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Edward was going to go back to Scotland but decided against it. He met with the barons in August of 1308 to discuss reform. In secret, Edward was chatting with Pope Clement V and King Philip IV of France to allow Piers to return to England. He was willing to suppress the Knights Templar in England, and he was willing to release Bishop Langton from prison. As a reminder, that was the bishop that he argued with when he wanted more money from the crown. Parliament met in April of 1309, and the barons refused to let Piers return to England. But they did give Edward additional taxes if he agreed to reform. Edward then told the Pope that the conflict around Piers's role was over. So the Pope told Edward that it was totally fine for Piers to return to England. Piers returned to England in June of 1309. Edward met with Parliament, and Edward agreed to limit the powers of the royal steward and the marshal of the royal household. And Parliament gave Edward new taxes for war with Scotland. Edward was now happy, and Parliament was now happy. At least for a little while. Soon there was trouble in paradise. The barons began to hate Piers even more. They thought that he was arrogant, and Piers did not help himself out. He would often refer to the earls by offensive names like the Dog of Warwick. It got so bad that some were refusing to attend Parliament in 1310 because they knew that Piers would be there. Meanwhile, Edward continued to go deeper into debt. He was also pissing off people because he was using the money that was reserved for purchasing provisions for the royal household, and he was buying supplies for war with Scotland. Edward was unable to raise an army to go to war with Scotland, and the earls took away his taxes. Their next step was to get Edward to get rid of Piers as his counselor. What they wanted was for Piers to be replaced by 21 elected barons. They were called the Ordainers. Edward agreed. Edward and Piers then went to Scotland, but Robert the Bruce refused to engage in war. Edward had to leave in the winter of 1311 because he had ran out of supplies and money. The Ordainers passed the Ordinances of 1311. These limited the king's right to go to war, and he couldn't grant land without Parliament's approval. The ordinances also exiled Piers again. This time around, he was not allowed to live anywhere within Edward's lands, and he was to be stripped of all of his titles. Both Edward and Piers went on the run, but not together. Edward went to Windsor and King's Langley, and Piers probably either went to France or Flanders. Edward was pissed, and he revoked the ordinances. He told Piers to come back to England, and Piers returned in January of 1312. This made the barons pissed. The Archbishop of Canterbury excommunicated Piers, and plans were made to capture Piers before he had the chance to run off to Scotland. So Edward, Piers, and Isabella ran to Newcastle. I'm sure Isabella was thrilled by that. And Edward's cousin, Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, and his followers were at their heels. With not much, they took a ship to Scarborough. Edward and Piers stayed together, but Isabella went to York. Piers was surrounded by earls, and so he decided to surrender to the Earl of Pembroke, Aymer de Valence, and the Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne. He surrendered after they made a deal that he would not be harmed and that they would reach a deal with the king by August 1st, 1312. Piers had gold, silver, and gems with him. He was accused of stealing those items from Edward, but there is no evidence to support this. The Earl of Pembroke took Piers to Dennington. Piers was guarded while Pembroke left for a little while. Now, no one knows if Pembroke was involved with what happened next, and that is why he left, or if the Earl of Warwick just saw an opportunity with Pembroke gone and he took it. The Earl of Warwick captured Piers and took him to Warwick Castle. A sham trial was held and Piers was found guilty. He was found guilty of violating the terms of the ordinances. His punishment was passed down, and it was execution. On June 19, 1312, Piers was taken to Black Clove Hill, and there Piers was executed. First, a sword was rammed through his stomach, and then, while he was down on the ground, he was beheaded. He was either around 27 or 28 years old. His body was left there out in the open to be exposed to the elements and picked apart by animals. When Edward heard about the execution of the man that he had spent 13 years loving, he was understandably devastated and furious. He wanted to go and get Piers's body so he could have him buried, but he wouldn't be able to do that until January 2nd, 1315, because Piers had been excommunicated, so he couldn't have a proper burial. Edward had to get a papal absolution for Piers. When Edward got the papal absolution, Piers got an elaborate funeral at King's Langley Priory. As I mentioned earlier, Edward was devastated. He did not see Piers's death as a lawful execution. To him, Piers's death was a murder, and he wanted the barons to pay for what they did. Edward made provisions for Piers's family. The Earl of Pembroke and the Earl of Surrey were angry about the Earl of Warwick's actions, and they started to support Edward. There was a real fear that a civil war would break out, but the Earl of Pembroke was able to reach a deal between Edward and the barons that avoided a civil war. The barons were pardoned for Piers's murder in exchange for them supporting a new campaign in Scotland, though at first Warwick and Lancaster were not on board with this deal. In June of 1313, Edward and Isabella went to Paris to meet with King Philip IV. Edward wanted to settle the issue with Gascony and to get Philip on his side and not on the barons. Things went well for Edward. Things had really worked out for Edward in England while he was away. Warwick and Lancaster were now on board with the campaign in Scotland. Taxes had been raised. He had gotten loans from Philip IV, from the Pope, and from an Italian banker named Antonio Pisano. For the first time, Edward's government was not in the red. I'm going to stop the episode here because there's no way that I can finish telling you this story in one episode. So this story is going to be 2 episodes long. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of the 4th season of History Shelf. I don't know how many episodes that this season is going to have, but I will be covering 15 people this season like I have the first 3 seasons. but I have no idea how many episodes that's going to take, because this is the first time that I've had to break someone's story up into 2 episodes, and I don't know if there's going to be any more people this season that it's going to take multiple episodes to tell their story. Next week's episode is going to be part 2 of King Edward II's story. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod. The Instagram is at History_Shelf_pod. And the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will send out a thank you to you on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. I will also choose one Patreon at random for each episode that I do, and at the end of the episode, I will give a shout out to that Patreon. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that you get the first tier, plus you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose the theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that you get the first 2 tiers, plus you will get a handwritten note of thanks mailed to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that you get the first 3 tiers, plus you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want except for the zip-up hoodie. You can also take out an ad on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliate links, there's one for Amazon, Riverside, and Bookshop. If you click on one of those links and you buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch and you don't want any of the perks, but you still want to support this podcast, I have turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the episode description for this episode. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways that you can help out for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. That would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. All right, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.